So nice to see you here. I really appreciate your coming here. And there's so many here who are part of this pioneer history, who are trailblazers with Asian America, our friends from ACCI and CACP. There's Kimberly Lee here, and there's Rod and Lucretia Lee, and Alice Kawazoe, and my cousin Susan Lee there, and who is very involved with the Lee family reunion. We're descendants of the Chinese railroad worker Li Wangzhang. And so many others, I'm sure, and I really appreciate your being here. So I'm speaking about a project that you can see online. It's the Giriac project, and it was an idea that Barry Fong and I had that started with our work as interviewers and documentarians for Stanford's Chinese Railroad Workers Project. We were asked by Gordon Chang to do oral history interviews of descendants of Chinese railroad workers. And when Gordon came to the office and said, I'd like you to do this, to interview people who were descendants of railroad workers on the Transcontinental Railroad, and we're talking about 1865 to 1867, I just said, Gordon, this is impossible. I said, how are we going to get any memories or anything vivid or any nuggets of history from, because it's for me, it'd be like 4 generations with my great-grandfather on my mother's side, and she remembers him as her grandfather, but he didn't talk about working on the railroad. And so many other people, they just didn't have this tradition of oral history. That's what I thought. And of course, when we proceeded and we had this questionnaire sent out to all these organizations, did you have an ancestor that came to America in the 1860s? That would be the key time. And amazingly enough, people sent answers, and some of them even had the Chinese names of their ancestors. So it just shows you, there are people in our community, and many of you here, who have had this tradition and have kept the stories of your ancestors. So we are so grateful, because this is true history. This is not something you cannot find in the history books. However, the very key thing that I'm going to be talking about today is the paper trail. And the paper trail originated from the dreaded Chinese exclusion law of 1882. It was the first immigration law after the Page Act, which was against Chinese then, to stop Chinese women from coming in 1875. That was the first immigration law. Before, there was just open immigration, just came through the port, and any port. And so with 1882, it was a watershed moment in which a race of people, the Chinese, would be denied naturalization to U.S. citizenship. That's the first time in history. And it also stopped the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. 10 years. So that, and what we're talking about today is the Geary Act, which extended the Chinese exclusion law by, this was in 1892. It's always May 5th. This, we have an anniversary date here. And it required, for the first time, registration and photo identification, and persons of Chinese ancestry had to carry this certificate at all times. If they were stopped without it, they would be fined, jailed, and possibly deported. So, okay, let's see. Next slide. This is the announcement that you've seen, and it shows the certificate for Wang Ru Hoi, a Chinese laborer residing in Mountain View, California. And the certificate is actually dated March 16th, 1894, but somebody pointed out to me who received this saying, you made a mistake. It's not 1892, because that was the year that the Chinese organized civil disobedience. They refused to register. And all certificates would be dated after the Supreme Court's ruling, which said the Chinese had to register, and that would be 1894. So just keep that in mind. That's what you have to be aware of. Okay. So here's the certificate that of Zhao Qi. His name on the payroll was Jim King, and we know this because his ancestor, whom we interviewed with the Stanford Chinese Railroad Workers Project, Jean O. Chan, said, okay, I have all the papers of my grandfather. His name on the payroll was Jim King. And in some of the immigration testimonies, he testified that he's Zhao Qi, but Jim King was his name. So that's how we have documentation that this guy, we have this photograph of a Chinese railroad worker, a worker on the Transcontinental Railroad. And so it was so exciting when we saw this, when we're interviewing Jean O. Chan. He's giving oral history, and then he has these papers to prove it. And he had this on his lap. He goes, oh, I have this one. And I look at it and I go, I recognize it because I have my grandfather's. It's a chalk G. That's what our family always called it, a chalk G. You have to keep your chalk G with you. And that is the certificate, same one as my grandfather had. I recognized. I said, Barry, look at this. And he goes, and he asked Jean O. Chan right away, do you have a scanner? Because he wanted the proof. He knew he was going to take it home. He just said, I have to show this. And we have a picture, because what we want is to put the faces, names and faces on these workers that have been denied their rightful due in history, the Chinese railroad workers. So that was our first one, and we started to look for more, and we interviewed overall 50 people who had, some proof of their ancestors. But this is the only certificate we had. We had, copies of the payroll, some memorabilia, which is very exciting, like spikes. This is very precious. So we decided, we have seen other ones since, and I have been thinking we've got to do something for this project to keep this history going, because it means so much. It's really about the history of struggle of immigrants, and it's very relevant today. And for instance, the challenge to birthright citizenship, the case of Wong Kim Ark in 1886, which re-established birthright citizenship, and that is a precedent that is used in arguments to defend birthright citizenship, which is being challenged today and continuing. So fight on. So here's a receipt for a $1 donation from Sin Fun, and I'm speaking Cantonese, of Ningyun District Association, issued by the Chinese 6 companies for legal fees to fight the Gary Act in the U.S. Supreme Court. So the Chinese were incredibly organized. Their communities, this is something that we understand, the nation did not understand, that all Chinese, they had an identity, and they had an association. They were connected to a family. Look, last name first, they connected to a family, then from there to a district association, and there to a larger association, and there to the 6 companies, which was like the Supreme Court for the Chinese. It was very, very important for them to, they had won some battles. They felt very, for instance, the Wong Kim Ark case, they won. And certain cases, like Gitmo versus Hopkins, that reaffirmed the rights of persons in the United States. That So they thought, well, we could challenge the Geary Act. We're gonna tell everybody, send out messages to every single community throughout the United States. And the network, I said, it was amazing to resist, saying this is a bad law, you must not register, do not register. And the Chinese complied because they didn't want to register, and they thought, I think we can win this. They had also allies. There are other community groups, there are certain, not all, certain religious groups and benevolent associations that were white that were opposed to the anti-Chinese movement, and they were allies, but it was the 6 companies that organized the fight. So this was very, it was a hard-fought battle, because you might have seen the play that took place here, a performance by Citizen Wong. He was a Wong Chin-fu, who was a spokesperson back east fighting the Chinese exclusion law. And he was very eloquent, and certainly Chinese Americans had journalists. They weren't Chinese American, they were Chinese in America. Unless they were, even when they were born, they were challenged, and they were never given full citizenship status. But they challenged the Geary Act, but they lost after a hard-fought battle. And so here we have, I'm going to show the certificates that came mostly from 1894. So the certificates tell you quite a bit. So you look at them, they're numbered. And also, when the Chinese refused to register and they lost the case, the Supreme Court ruled that upheld the exclusion law as constitutional. It was unjust, but it was constitutional, saying that the government has a right to identify foreigners, a right to deport foreigners. So, but all of the Chinese refused to register. They would not be in prison. They were given a period of grace. They had to register within a year. So they complied. So the provisions of the Act of May 5th, 1892, 134 years ago. Here's Ji Hua, a Chinese laborer. See, there's a stand for laborer. And he was presiding at Portland, Oregon, during that time of passage. He's 45 years old. I'm sorry, 44. It's hard to read some of this flourishy writing. And his occupation is strawberry grower. And where does he live now? He lives in Watsonville. And I feel such a connection with this Ji Hua, because I can still buy strawberries in Watsonville. And so there was a large group of these certificates that I saw at what was called then the Historical Museum of San Jose, or San Jose Historical Museum. They had archives, and I was researching my book. This is in 1990, and I went to the archives and I talked to the archivist, and I needed documentation. This is Leslie Matsunaga. She opens a drawer, and she has a stack of these. And I said, I need one for the book, I want San Jose. And she goes, take your pick. So I got this one. And I had another one that's in the book. And it's Ju Sing, and it's 6th Street, Chinatown. What is 6th Street, Chinatown? It's Hymanville. If you go to 6th Street, Jackson Street now, there's a project called 6th Street Jackson. It's Japantown. And there's Hymanville Park. That's the side of the Hymanville. So you'll see some of the history there. Some of you've been there. But so this tells you quite a lot. And this is Ju Sing, and he's a laborer, but his occupation is contractor. So a contractor is the one who hires fellow Chinese. And he's one of them, but he's sort of the head man. He could probably speak some English. Growers would come to Chinatown and talk to him, just say, give me some Chinamen. And then he would, recruit some of his friends and they'd go. So that's what a contractor did in those days. And this is, this is the third. Okay, this is exactly 133 years ago. It's May 30, anyway, 34 years ago. May 3rd, 1894. So there you go. Okay. So here's Tong Lu, farmer. Woolen Mills Chinatown, because you remember after the burning of the Mark Street Chinatown, there were 2 Chinatowns. Some people said, we're not going to Heinleinville, we're not going to work with John Heinlein. We already have a place that we work in the woolen mills, and we're going to be living there. We're going to start a Chinatown there. So a smaller Chinatown was established at the woolen mills that ended in 1903. But here you have a certificate from the Woolen Mills Chinatown to prove it existed. So, okay, he's a laborer, and what is his occupation? Farmer. That's what San Jose was, farmlands. And here is Yong Kai, and this certificate was submitted by sort of a village cousin of mine. Her last name is the same as mine, Young, and her father was a cousin to a cousin and a Young Family Association. And she said, I think I have one of those certificates. And so she submitted this, and it's on our website. And it's Yong Kai. My grandfather's name was Yong Hua Guo. And he has a certificate dated the same date, and they both were cooks in San Francisco. This was after the burning of Market Street Chinatown, when a lot of Chinese, including my grandfather, fled for a few years and stayed in San Francisco and found work as cooks. So here he is. He's 37 years old, and they give his address on Washington Street, right in Chinatown. And then they have a stamp here. It's not all fancy handwriting. San Francisco, California. And here's another cook from San Francisco. And this came from a collection, the Wing Loop collection in Washington, D.C. It's Washington State. And you've probably seen maybe some of you have been to the Wing Loop Museum in Seattle. So his last name is Yin Cook, and he registered in San Francisco, but he had to report that at the time of the Geary Act, he resided in Port Townsend, Washington. And so that explains why it's at the Wing collection. This is a Chin Jung laundryman. This is unusual, Boston, Massachusetts. So the Chinese were all over the place, but in the certificates that we have from people back east, the Chinese were either cooks or laundrymen, not farmers. However, we have, here's Pretoria, Illinois, also Wing Loop Museum collection. Wu Soi, he's a laborer, and Pretoria is written there twice, so he registered there, and he is 30 years old. Okay. It was great to see the faces. This is somebody that is in history books, and there are several books written about him. One is called The Chinaman Tycoon, and it's Liu Hing, 1858 to 1934. He's the first Chinese industrialist in America, founder of the Pacific Fruit Packing Company, Canton Bank, Pacific Coast Canning Company, Mexicali Mercantile Company, China Mail Steamship Company, and this was submitted by his great-grandson, Bruce Kwan Jr., who also wrote a book about several generations of his family. So Bruce Kwan was very proud to have the certificate. He said it obviously looked like it had been taken out many times to show who he was. And instead of labor, it has persons other than labor. See, that's a stamp. And it's repeated twice, 36 years old, and he is a, what they call him, merchant, Lu Hing, and well, his classification would be merchant, so he would be able to go back to China and come back under this, not a laborer. So now I come to the first woman certificate that I had, and I got this only a few years ago, sitting next to a woman that I never met before. It was at the 90th anniversary of the Cathay Post Legion, Cathay Post American Legion. And she was there, you know, to honor, you know, we were all there to honor our ancestors. And I always ask people, you know, well, so you live in San Francisco, and where did your family come here? And it got so that she said, yeah, I think I have some documents on my family. They came here, were here very early, and when I hear documents, my heart starts pounding. And I said, did they have pictures on it? She goes, yeah, I think so. And then the next day, she sends me scans of this woman and her husband and their child. And I just about, that was an exciting thing. So here it is, the mother, she's, the woman's name, my friend now, is Janice Tong. And this is her great-great-grandmother. And she's a Chinese laborer, and she lives in San Francisco, and she's, she's a seamstress, that's her occupation, and she's 25 years old, and let's see, her name is Chu Fly Ji, so, okay. And this is her husband, laborer, and his name is Munjek, and they gave the names, and I'm sure they were pronounced in the Cantonese, and they were spelled the way the person who's the registrar thinks it sounds like. So that's why they have the spelling that sometimes their offspring had to carry for the rest of their lives. So let's see, it says sewing machine hand. That meant he was helping, he was like a mechanic in the sewing machine factory. And he is, let's see, how old is he? He's 35 years old, okay? And this is their son, 8 years old, US born son Munjek and Chen Hua Kuai Li, and persons other than labor. He was born in San Francisco 8 years earlier, and he is, it does not say citizen or American, it says persons other than labor. They don't know what else to call him. So, let's see, he resides on Washington Street. There must be a lot of Chinese living there. And then, let's see, it gives his height as 3 feet 11 inches. And let's see, what is it? And what is his job? He's a schoolboy. Yay. So that was the family, and we were very excited, and that's one of our early certificates that we posted in our website. So this is another person other than labor. His name is Wu Kung Chong, age 12, and let's see, he lives on Washington Street again. My goodness, what is, and you probably know Washington Street, right, in Chinatown, it's a long street, and so there were tenements. My mother was born in Chinatown, not on Do Street, but her father was born on Do Street with, and I found his cousins were born in the same building, so it was very crowded. Think of the tenements they had. So, let's see, he's, okay, let's see, anyway, what is his job? He's occupation none. He doesn't have a job. He probably was working. Yeah, he was a laborer. American-born laborer. They would never ever say citizen. They just couldn't. There's no stamp for citizen in connection with Chinese, even for American-born. So this is another this came from a friend of mine, Karen Lee, and she's doing her family history, and she submitted this certificate when Barry and I were doing a documentary called Digging to Chinatown. We wanted a child, a picture of a child. This is Junction City, California, but he registered in Sacramento, because maybe Junction City was too small. So he is a student, but this one actually says, it has persons other than labeled, but somebody wrote in native-born child. So that's something, twice. So that's the first one I've seen like that. So here's another woman who is native-born in Wadsworth, California, registered in Sacramento, and she is 22 years old, and her identification, her occupation is, she's a general laborer, so native born. But it's really pathetic. They could not say even where she was born. So Moy Wah Jin is a merchant, and this is interesting, a merchant from Boston, Massachusetts. So he's 29 years old. He might have, to be a merchant, you have to show that you own a certain number of shares in a store. You can't just say you're a merchant. You have to have proof. So he obviously passed, and so, and all stores did some kind of labor contracting. People could walk in and say, where can I hire a Chinaman as a servant or something? You know, it's just so hypocritical, because people, the same people who would be railing against the Chinese would be employing them. And this is Lee, my farmer, another Santa Clara Valley farmer. And this is interesting because, again, 38 years old. That means he was here for so long in Santa Clara, and he is lives as a farmer and Mountain View. So let's see, he's residing in Santa Clara, but he registered in Mountain View. So the communities were very close, all farming. This is interesting because this is Don Yin Gardner, age 45, Vina, California. And this ended up in a stack of the ones that I found in the San Jose Museum that later disappeared, and they ended up in the California Historical Society. And they later disappeared from there because the California Historical Society no longer exists. All the archives are now at Stanford. So these things got moved around. And we guess that a lot of these, for instance, a big stack of them would be certificates that were held by a family association in a store for safekeeping if the person traveled or went back to China. They would not take it with them. So, okay, and Vina, California, is between Chico and Redding. It's in Tehama County. And this person is a gardener. And Vina, California, was a large piece of territory owned by Leland Stanford. So all of the Chinese were employed by Leland Stanford. And the fact that this person is 45 years old makes me think he worked for Leland Stanford on the Central Pacific Railroad. So before we got the Jim King certificate, I go, I think I have a picture of a railroad worker. So this is the youngest one that we have, the youngest certificate. This came from Bruce Kwan, who is a great grandson of Li Hing, and this would be his, like an aunt, a great grand aunt. I know you, but she is a person other than laborer. She was born in San Francisco, and she has no occupation. But we just think it's so adorable. The children were photographed, and they all, some of them looked like festive clothes from Chinese New Year, and a girl would have sort of a headband kind of hat, you see. So from these certificates, you get some of the idea of the children's clothing. So we're going to go to Hawaii. So in 1900, there was a Congressional Act of April 30th, 1900, that required all residents, Chinese, in the territory of Hawaii to register. And it said that Chinese labor, whether he has this certificate or not, will not be allowed to enter any state, territory, or district of the United States from the Hawaiian Islands. And can you imagine? So it was, you see, this country was trying to protect itself from being a diverse country, obviously, and absolutely to keep the Chinese out. Because supposedly, you know, there's so many reasons. It did start with labor, but basically it was incredible racism and the fear of being overrun by Chinese, Asian people. So, and this extended later to the Japanese. But here you have, I did not know about this provision that affected Hawaii until I saw a certificate. And the first certificate that I saw that my daughter, Jessica, you found for me is this one. And it's, you know, it's obviously been through a lot. It's a certificate of residence of the Act of April 30th, 1900, issued to Chinese laborer. The laborer was born in the island of Kauai. His name is Wong Hing Chong. He's a male child. He's 4 years old.
He's a laborer.
And he's identified as a laborer. So, you know, have we made a point about this? The fact is, the papers were like, they had to be carried by the resident, and they kept the person as an outcast, a perpetual foreigner, and guilty until proven innocent. So now the reality, people would carry these papers, but day-to-day life, the Chinese worked with white people. It's certainly in Santa Clara County. This is a picture that was given to me by this little girl when she was in her 90s, when I first started researching in 1970, when I found Chinese in Santa Clara County. So I started kind of early. But I was able to get stories of people who had worked with Chinese on their farms, who grew up with Chinese. So, and during the time of exclusion. So here it is, and it's on Hofstetter Road, Aba, and this is Edith Heron. She's telling me the story. She goes, oh, he was a wonderful young man. He was a wonderful old guy, and we called him Aba. His name was Aba, and we Cantonese, we know what Aba means. It means old uncle, Aba, you know. So his name, she always called him Ba. And the family was so fond of him. He would babysit the kids. She said she would go there and have dinner with these guys in a circle, and they would put butter. She wanted butter on her rice. and she, obviously, they were treated not like family, but certainly as companions, associates, you know, and respected and honored for their work. That you trust their kids with them. And you see the horses. This is our ranch. This is the ranch, the Heron Ranch. And so the father took that picture. Edith Heron said, oh, my dad took a picture and also took a picture of a Bach with his friend, who is not called Bach, I forgot his name. But, so it's on Heron Ranch, Hofstetter Road, and some of you might know that road on the way to the airport, San Jose, the Manetta Airport. So, okay. And this is Highlandville Children in San Jose, 1895. This photograph was given to me by the niece of the little girl, second from the left, and also her brother's on the right here, and that's Lin Shu. So it's Pearl Shu who gave me this photograph. When I was interviewing, she goes, oh, I have a photograph, would you like it? And I go, oh my goodness, it's like a pleasure. Because It's a picture of children, and you know what time it was? It was Chinese New Year, when the parents want a picture of their children wearing those clothes.
Yeah.
And you see there are all the Qing Dynasty outfits, and you see how adorable the little girl who's smiling so cutely. She has a headband, and you know she's a girl. And the other one without a hat is a girl. The king emperor hat is a boy. See, so anyway, I think this is a delightful picture, and I call it Haimanville's first generation. And their parents came from Market Street, Chinatown. So, and others, I'm trying to humanize this. You know, when I was hoping to show this to a lot of the school children to say, look, they're kids who, you know, had fun like, in the streets of San Jose. There's Haimanville Chinatown children, Sam Lee and James Chan, who, as adults, were interviewed for the video, Home Base, was Chinatown, it was CHCP's movie, and it was made by my daughter Jessica Yu. So, and these are, they grew up with my father, and they were all friends, so I was able to get good photographs and interviews. So, and this is the certificate that I lived with all my adult life, and was kind of, I treasured it. My parents treasured, I mean, when they showed it to me, actually, I was writing something in 1972, and I needed something for the article, a cover. It was actually used as a cover for a journal. And my mother just took this out, and it looks so neat. I mean, you can see the folds, but it certainly looks nice after all these years. And that's my grandfather, you know. I thought of it more like this portrait on the, you know, the right. But here he is. He came, the story is he came to Market Street, Chinatown at the age of 11. And he went in, he was a houseboy, and then later he grew strawberries. And during the time he was a strawberry grower, as a teenager, he could look up and see some flames, smoke. His home base was burning. And that was May 4th, 1897. And he and his friends, they fled to San Francisco. They had given up their strawberry growing business because it wasn't that was one thing the Chinese could do that was very, very popular. People loved the strawberries. They were grown road crops by the Chinese. And they could be shipped by train to San Francisco. And in a few days, they could still be fresh in Colorado. So anyway, that was the end of strawberry growing for him. And he became a cook, just like the other cook of his cousin, of the certificate you saw earlier. But since he came early, he had a re-entry permit. He was able to go back to China, get married to my grandmother, but he wasn't able to bring her over. They were separated for 14 years until he became a merchant in Haimanville, thanks to Haimanville. And here's the young family. My grandmother was able to have a family in her 30s, you know. She met my uncle, Ming, and then a year later, that's my father, John, and that's my grandfather as a merchant, very, very proud. And he was not only a merchant, he was the head of the Revolutionary Party of Sun Yat-sen in San Jose. We're very proud of it. So, and this was a crowning moment in his life. And this is a Pan Pacific Exposition. And you can see my grandfather's there in the front row, representing San Jose. So it was victory. It was like 1915, and the Sun Yat-sen had succeeded. He was the first president of the Republic of China. They thought, this is fantastic, that they couldn't be American citizens, but at least they could be citizens of China, which was an ally of the U.S. at the time. The U.S. said, they had great relations at that moment because China was a republic. And here's a young family in 1930. It was sort of the end of Hainan-do. It was during the Depression. You could see everybody's very worn, except for the young guys. There's my uncle Ning. He trained he was the first Chinese American to get a transport license, but he couldn't get a job, and he couldn't be a pilot for the Americans until he was, well, it was very early. He went to China to train pilots in Canton, and he was killed in a reconnaissance mission in 1937 because China was fighting the Japanese before Pearl Harbor for 10 years. But he was killed. It was very, you can imagine how heartbroken the parents were. But they had hope. They had the son, my father, who took ROTC at Stanford and became an officer and went overseas after Pearl Harbor as a lieutenant in China, Burma, India, and was at the Battle of Chungsan. And, his medal is displayed at CHCP, that's an exhibit. And during the war, my father, I grew up in Whittier, and this is Yong Sung Kwong, and granddaughter, that's me. Yeah. And he's very proud, even though I was the second daughter. My sister was born first. They go, oh, another girl. So, and then here, in those days, the U.S. and China were allies. The Chinese government was training pilots in America. They had the U.S. and China were allies, so they sent over pilots to be trained in Arizona, and they came to visit LA. And my grandfather was so proud because he was thinking of his son overseas, and also his son who had passed away fighting, who died fighting in the Japanese in Canton. And there's my grandmother. She's wearing one of the jades that I'm wearing now. This was so yeah, I have to. And I'm sitting right in front of my grandfather. I had an esteemed position there. So, and I do remember, and there's my sister in the back. And there's the tallest cadet. He was from Shandong, China. I do remember him. And then the civilian is my uncle. And then my father was overseas. And when my mother sent my father pictures of her with all these cadets. And my father wrote a letter from the Burma Road saying, I don't want to see any pictures of you with these guys. I only send pictures of my parents and the girls. And you. So, anyway, can you imagine how he felt? Okay, so my father returned safely from the war, and he was a major, and he was, my brother was born in 1946, and this is 3 generations, Yong Sung Kwong, John C. Young, and grandson Al Young, my brother, Seattle, who's my late brother, who was a teacher of the year in Seattle and champion race car driver. So some of the right stuff of the Young family. He passed away 3 years ago. So anyway, this is the picture of my grandfather. You can see how proud he is. And this is still Whittier. A year later, he had passed away, and our family had already moved to San Francisco, where my father started a soy sauce business and became a Chinatown leader in San Francisco. And this is my last photograph, and this is a photograph by Corky Lee, May 10th, 2019, and it shows, you probably recognize some of the people in there. This is a photograph of descendants of Chinese railroad workers. And actually it's a larger group, it's descendants of pioneers. And I show it to show that the Geary Act did not succeed in driving the Chinese out. That the generations, the people fought to stay in America, and they stayed to build lives here and have families, and to sort of forge a new spirit. But also, they felt, I mean, this is what my family felt. And my mother and father were among 5 Chinese who attended the 100th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, May 10th, 1969. And that is when Phil Choi was invited to present the plaque to Chinese railroad workers. He was invited, and at the last minute, at this grand celebration, the Golden Spike celebration, he was told by Thomas Goodfellow, the chairperson for the event, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Choi, there's no time for you." So he was denied that right to speak. Barry Fong and I made a documentary about that. But my mother was in the audience. She was the only descendant of railroad worker here. And there were only, out of 20,000 people, there was just a handful of Chinese. So as a contrast, 50 years later, here is this incredible representation. And Corky and me have been fighting for this recognition and staging this photograph for years before this event. You know, he had reenactments. But this time he said, I want all the descendants, everybody. So everybody, we're descendants. You know, so, in fact, Susan, you're in the picture.
Yes.
Susan, there's Susan Lee and her husband Jeff. And then you can see right in the middle in yellow, there's Jerry Wong.
Jerry Wong, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's the people in the front there's let's see, the organizers of in Utah, what's his name, the judge. Okay, well, anyway, I have everybody's, could see, probably recognize anybody here. Was anybody there besides you? Were you there? Anybody? Okay, so there are different versions of this picture, because he took a lot of them. And in his book, there's a beautiful book on Corky Lee of his photographs, and there's a nice one there. Maybe it's this. Okay, I'm the one in the blue dress. I gave the commencement address, and I must say, I was invited, and knowing the history, knowing the history, and knowing what my Phil Choi went through, he felt for the rest of his life he had failed. And I said, you did not fail. America failed you. And so all these years, and the work of the Chinese Historical Society, and the work of so many people in our community, and especially the Chinese descendants in Utah, they said we're going to control this. We're going to be a major part of it. And I was invited to be the spokesperson for that day to give a 4-minute address, because I had represented descendants at the Hall of Labor honoring of Chinese railroad workers. It was the first time that the American government ever recognized Chinese nationalists as building the railroad. And that was in 2014, May 9th, not 10th. And we had all the descendants who were around there who could go to Washington, D.C. on the stage, and I gave a short speech. And at that time, I had it all written. I was kind of, I wasn't as capable as I was a few years later, because I didn't do all the oral histories until a few years later. But it was a great moment. It was a great moment to see a plaque under United Farm Workers, under Francis Perkins. It goes Chinese Railroad Workers, and it's in the Hall of Honor at the Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. But the big thing, as far as, that's permanent. This was a very, very special day because it's the 150th anniversary, and I was invited to give, they called it a commencement speech. But up to the last minute, I was so paranoid that somebody would say, "Okay, Connie, there's no time for you." And then I remember my brother was driving. We had so much traffic to get to the promontory, but such a line of traffic. But I was able to go to a special lot, and I started running. I said I had to run to the tent to figure out the lineup. And then they had these long flyers with the sort of a mock-up of great event, you know, that old-fashioned poster. And on the back it had that program, and it had the listing of speakers. And the first line said, commencement, Connie Young Yale, Chinese Historical Society of America. I could not believe it. I just still was so incredulous. And then the opening of the ceremony was a lion dance. It was with children of, they were probably, you know, they were not Chinese, they were probably, you know, from Utah, Mormon children, and it was a diverse group. And they did a lion dance, and then there was music, and then I was announced, and I made my speech, and I got through it, and I was just so, you know, I couldn't believe it. My first line was that, you know, I'm Connie Young Yale, a Chinese American. No, I didn't even say Chinese, I said I'm an American. And that, and I mentioned that 50 years ago, my mother was the only descendant here today. I hear at that time, and here I am. And then I talked about why it took so long, and I talked about the exclusion, and also the fact that what we should be celebrating was the incredible teamwork of building the railroad, because the Irish and the Chinese, they had this incredible teamwork working together. And I talked about 10 miles a day and how that was done, a feat never repeated again. The fact that it was such coordination, and the Chinese wanted to do it. They were told that, can you do it? And they said they were all for it. This is what the engineers report said many years later. And it was just like clockwork. The 8 Irish rail handlers laid the rails, and the Chinese had graded the tracks. It was just boop, 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 boop. And it took, hundreds of people were involved, but it was the rail handlers that got the attention, of course, and their names were in history, but not the names of the Chinese. And so this was a great time to honor them, and to say that this was a moment that we should all celebrate, and that it belonged to all of us. So anyway, when I finished you know, there was they had this horns and bells, and it was just a great moment. I just thought, how did I get through it? And one of my friends, Li Chin, she just said, your ancestors up there. So I thought that was a fitting tribute to them. So. Anyway, I didn't expect to do so much on the railroad, but it's part of our background. So thank you very much.
I have to say, I'm so grateful for Connie being such a wonderful historian, and she has documented so many stories and history about Chinese Americans' contribution to United States. And so I think at this, I just have a quick question. If the baby was born, did the parents have to apply for that certificate of,
well,
you know?
Yes, they did. Well, the thing is, first of all, they got a birth certificate. That was so important. And I have the birth certificate of some of those kids, because they were stapled on, you know, in the documentation, so that they were born, you know. But I guess so, because the law just said all Chinese had to register, and the reason why the parents did it is they felt it was a safeguard, because it's kind of ridiculous, because after a few years the kid's not going to look like that, right? You know?
Yeah.
But at least they just felt that's the law, they're going to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And then another follow-up question is, at what point the law was, what's the word?
Repealed?
Terminated?
It wasn't terminated. The Chinese exclusion law was extended another 10 years, because remember, it's 10 years, and by 1902, it was made permanent. And so by that time, maybe the Geary Act, they just stopped issuing them. They had other identity cards. Like my mother had. So a lot of people had been sending Barry, who's asking people to submit the certificates. They sent in registration cards, identity cards Like the one that you've seen a lot is Anna May Wong's identity card. It's the same idea. It's a green card. That's what it is. We call it a yellow card. So
Yeah, so eventually it was,
yeah, it was abolished by the time the exclusion law was ended when the U.S. and China were allies. You know, I think they just dropped it. But in 1943, you know, Chinese could apply for citizenship, could be naturalized.
to be naturalized, yeah. So let's give a big round of applause for the audience. We are just so happy you're here. And at this time, I would like to present
Well, that's good.
the flower.
Oh, I love flowers, thank you. Oh, the early flower growers, thank you so much.
Yay!
Let's look at that
Okay,
first.
okay, hey, look at, okay,
Okay.
very happy.
And then
So-
this one.
Oh,
Thank you. And then any
picture.
question from the audience?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Can you give us historically how the Page Act relates to your talk,
Oh,
or
yeah,
to the
Page
Exclusion Act?
yes. The Page Act, and I read, thank you, so there was so much, there was so much persecution of Chinese in the early 70s. Remember, that was Dennis Kearney, you know, saying the Chinese must go, and all the, even clergy people saying the Chinese are ruining, corrupting our youth, or heathens, and they were being attacked for their, by also segments of society, but maybe mostly by labor.
Perception of taking away jobs.
Yeah, for taking away
Especially
jobs,
during
and
the
for lower,
Depression.
they call it demeaning labor. And it was a rallying cry to organize Chinese labor, to organize white labor, because there was actually an organization called the Grand Order of the Caucasians. It's true, it's, you know, and, so I think that the Page Act was actually to keep, they said, to stop, they said, there are no moral Chinese women. So all Chinese women have to be banned. There should no Chinese women could enter. So how did I have, my grandfather who worked on the railroad was so lucky, he came right back to San Francisco, Chinatown, got involved with the store, became a merchant, later headed the, he was able to bring his wife over. She was one of 3, this is very interesting and involving, she was one of 3 Chinese women on a boat that came before the Page Act, maybe, must have been 1873, because there were kids born in. And there were 3 women. One of the women was my great-grandmother, her name was Qin Shi, and then the other woman was, let's see, it's one of my cousins, you know, it's Tatwina's mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Tatwina's grandmother, your sister-in-law's mother, yeah. And so, I mean, grandmother, I'm sure. So the society was very small in those days. You know, they all lived probably on Dopant Guy. So there were very few Chinese women, and the ones who came who had families, like we were very lucky. The Lee family is very large. But the other family, I forgot the last name. Wong. Anyway, they all, you know, stayed in San Francisco, and they were, it did work for a while,
Yeah.
and then it was later amended.
Thank you.
That people could bring over, merchants could bring over wives. But it was to prevent, as they said, all the Chinese women in America are prostitutes. That's it, you know.
Thank you.
Hope that answers.
Other questions, you see, because you see, we had the shows and said, you see, all the workers come from the Canton region, right?
Yes.
So your grandparents also come from the Sili,
yes,
right?
from-
4 county, right?
Yes,
It's called
it's
4
from,
counties.
Pyeongsan, or Zhongshan County.
中
Dongmu, now.
康恩、恩平、台州 4 counties, right? Okay.
Yeah, from that county, all, so it was Toisan.
Taisan, yes,
Toisan was
yeah.
had the largest number of people employed by the railroad, because the contractors went to the villages that were very poor. That they're, you know, people think, the general belief is that Chinese came for the gold rush. The largest numbers came during the building of the railroads, and I say that in plural, because they needed lots of labor. Central Pacific employed up to 15,000, and then there was, you know, agriculture. All these big industries at the time needed Chinese labor, so they came from they had recruiters going to our village. What was that village? Sunqing Village. It was right in Toisan. I visited that village. My mother called it a railroad village. She said there are railroad villages in our district. And she's speaking as a third generation. I mean, it's amazing. The connection with China was very, very strong. And while we were, anyway, I hope I answered your question before I go off on another history.
I think it's right. You see, when the playwriters, they write the beginning of it. It's a woman. You see, came from the boat, and then you see people just carry. Get them. You see into, you know, they think you see all the Chinese women are the, you know, So they started with this, but for in our generations, we cannot vision that term. So when the play started, we just, we don't want that, you know, so that's the concept.
So I have to tell you about the 3 Chinese women, and I wrote about it. There's a book that I co-edited that has the interviews, the stories written by the people that we interviewed, 9 stories. It's called Voices from the Railroad, stories of descendants from the railroad. And you can get it from Chinese Historical Society of America, you can get it online. But I have my story on Li Wangxiang, and I talked about his wife coming over. This is oral history, that the 3 women were so terrified, and they must have had a nice cabin, because these were merchants sending for their wives. And they scared each other, telling stories of things that they had heard about. And one of the women was saying that she had heard that there are men with red hair who eat people. And I thought, she must have heard about the Donner Party. I just can't imagine. But they were just scaring each other, you know, just saying, you know, what are we going to do? Of course, when they got there, they were met by, you know, the merchants. That was a little better time. But in the very, very early days, when Chinese workers came, there would be people throwing rocks, and, you know, the Chinese and the workers would be taken by wagon to their quarters. And there was reports saying that the Chinese men would just be, you know, stoned all the way to Chinatown. But obviously, these women were taken care of, and they met their husbands. So there are other stories, but they obviously settled in Chinatown and had subsequent generations, and I benefited from their courage. So.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there any duplicate copies of these documents at the National Archives in San Bruno?
No. San Bruno doesn't have the Giriac. San Bruno has the testimonies that came, I guess after, no, they were early. Before Angel Island, there was the immigration station was called the Mopo. It was a wooden building on the wharf. And then when Angel Island was built in 1910, they go, okay, now there's going to be no cheating, there's no collaboration. But then there are all the testimonies and the boards of inquiry. My grandmother, this is the daughter-in-law of the railroad worker. When she came, this is her second trip. She came when her husband had passed away. She came with her American-born children back from a trip. She was detained on Angel Island for 15 and a half months. I have her testimony, all these papers. And I have they attached my grandfather's birth certificate. No CRs, no. You know. I think they were very early, and they were not applicable for that time.
So 15 and a half months.
Yeah, in the
At your
barracks,
island?
yeah. And it's like, and she was released by the appeal, it's appealing to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, and she's finally released. Yeah, and it was lucky because her husband, her late husband, worked for Levi Strauss, and my aunt and her sisters, my mother was too young, went to the office of her father's employer and said, please help us. Our mother's detained on Angel Island. And Walter Haas, the president of Levi Strauss, said, I'll get my best lawyer on that. He'll be, don't worry, it's gonna be taken care of in no time. It took 15 and a half months. It was that tough. So, because she was born in China. And, here's another law that affected all women at the time, regardless of race. If a woman loses her husband, if she's a widow, she loses the status of her husband. For instance, the re-entry permit that she had says that she's the wife of a merchant, of an American born. But if he's gone, she has no identity. It's just hard to comprehend.
Pink.
Hi, I'm curious, by that time, when the railroad work finished, some of the laborers went back to China? Like, do we know how many stayed and how many left?
We don't, but obviously there's a number, there must have been a substantial number that went back, because that was sort of a promise to their village too. They would go back, and a lot of them were married or engaged. My great-grandfather was engaged already to make sure that he'd come back, but he wanted to stay. And so you'd have to be very fortunate to be able to stay. You'd have to have a job. You know, you'd have to, because, and actually the railroad brought a lot of Chinese to the Midwest or further down. And there's stories of the Chinese who wanted to open laundries. That's the only thing they could do, open laundries. And laundries were in demand. I mean, really, Chinese laundry. But there's Harper's Weekly would have these stories, and they would have drawings, and they talked about, they showed Chinese being shoved back on a train, and with one had, a sign trying to open a laundry, like, they don't want a Chinese laundry in their town. They don't want Chinese. So it was really tough. But enough Chinese made it to certain places, because that's why even in Montana and places that really were trying to ban Chinese. It was just like, and after the Chinese, after the building of the railroad, a lot of them stayed to work on different lines, because the railroad kept building. But by 1869, there was so much more work for the Chinese to do. And there's a famous picture showing the Chinese working on a trestle, a beautiful picture. There's very few that actually show that many Chinese, but this was taken after the Golden Spike ceremony, because they still had done in such a hurry. They had to still build snow sheds and lots of other things to build on the railroad, and safety things, and then continue other lines in Southern California, the LA line. There's a famous. There's more research on that famous railroad, the Southern Pacific. The Central Pacific became the Southern Pacific, and then it became the Union Pacific. If you go to ski in Sugar Bowl, right next to Sugar Bowl is the longest tunnel, 1,600 feet, the length of a football field. That was one of the railroads. One of the 15 tunnels, the longest, that was excavated by the Chinese. You can see it. There's a lot of graffiti there. But you see how many more Chinese had to stay. And then Leland Stanford, oh my goodness.
Oh.
If you have time for this, I have.
Yes,
I'm
we have
recording.
time.
Okay.
Yeah, we
I'm
got-
on the Stanford Chinese Workers Task Force, and we're writing a report. And this is from the Office of the Provost. And it's to study the role the Chinese had to play in building the university. And also, the Leland Stanford's fortune, his employment of Chinese, we're making a report to, again, the result would be an acknowledgement and recognition for the Chinese in building Stanford University. And the fact that Stanford University would not exist without Chinese labor on building the Transcontinental Railroad, by which Leland Stanford made one of the biggest fortunes in the United States. He was president of the Central Pacific, the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. At the same time, he was governor of California. So you can imagine, is that conflict of interest? Yes. But he owned land in like 15 counties in California. And I mentioned Vina, California, where the Chinese gardener was working. He was developing agricultural techniques and irrigation, innovations. He was into a lot of this industry. This would be the tech industry of the time. And who would be the workers but Chinese? And he actually had good relations with the Chinese. The Chinese respected him. They felt that the working for Leland Stanford was a good position because he protected them. There are industries that ban Chinese from working there. They would be chased from place to place. But if you worked at Stanford or you worked on this farm, you were protected. And what we have found out is that Mrs. Stanford was threatened for having employed Chinese. So, they went through something. But we just have to realize that Leland Stanford was a politician. He had that's his personal life, his personal business, his private work. But as a politician, he voted for the Geary Act, and the Exclusion Act. I think we'll have to figure out. He might have abstained, maybe not voted. But anyway, the Geary Act he did vote for. So they all did. It's like this administration, they all followed. Just like.
So can you say something about Yosemite? Because somebody sent me information.
Oh, yes,
about
the fact
contribution.
that Yosemite, also the roadways were developed by the Chinese, and there's a famous cook there.
Yes.
And I don't know much about it, but I think that there's a story that he was there for so long and much revered and loved and helped develop the tourist industry. But the most important thing is the labor, the roadways. Developing, transportation, developing the infrastructure. And we have found out from excavation and also some records that parts of the quad, the infrastructure of the quad at Stanford were built by Chinese workers. And that 166 trees on Palm Drive were all planted by Chinese workers under the direction of the groundskeeper named Jim Ma. And we interviewed his descendants.
Sorry, I think it's a mic.
Okay. Oh,
So at this time, do we have more questions? If not, maybe we can have
Take
a
a
group
picture.
picture.
Pictures. Yeah.
Like everybody come forward. You will be in the center. And the grandkids.
Yeah.